Well, the first civil war had ended in 1646. Parliament had won, and everybody then thought that the king would negotiate. But Parliament wasn't united. There were lots of different factions, and the king tried to play one off against the other, really. And in 1648, he kind of created a rebellion in England, but he also got the Scots to invade England on his behalf. And so a second civil war broke out then, and it was a much tougher, much nastier civil war. I think that the parliamentarians thought, okay, you're the king, we would expect you to try and defend your right to reign, but God has decided against you. You've lost the first civil war, now negotiate. But he failed to do so. The stakes got raised big time. And Parliament really was more than a match for the rebellion. They put down the rebellions in England, in Wales and in Kent, and in the north of England. And Cromwell himself defeated the Scots around Preston in the summer of 1648. So it was a brief civil war, but really it sealed Charles's doom, because it was after that that a strong number of people started to think the king has got to go.
And then, so this coin that we have here today is from the siege of Pontefract Castle. Could you tell us about the castle, about the siege, and just a little bit of information on that?
Pontefract was an immensely important castle, and it had been for many, many centuries, because it commanded a crossing of the River Aire. Pontefract means broken bridge. Okay. And also it was where the Great North Road went. So it was a very important river crossing. And to all intents and purposes, it was the gateway to the north, if you're coming from the south, or conversely, the gateway to the south, if you were coming from the north. So if you've got a Scottish army invading, control of Pontefract would have been quite an important thing to achieve. And it was a very, very powerful castle. Now you go there and there's not a great deal that's left because it was demolished after the Civil War. But at the time, it was a huge affair. You know, it was like a sort of Windsor of the north, really. And all sorts of people ended up there in history. So Richard II was probably murdered there. Thomas of Lancaster, who rebelled against Edward II, it was his castle. It's where Catherine Howard probably committed the indiscretions that led to her execution. It's a major place. So you command Pontefract, and it can be a real nuisance to the opposition.
Absolutely. And so obviously Charles I is there, he's a key figure. Are there any other key figures in the siege that we know about from history?
Well, the commander of the garrison there, or the royalists, was a chap called John Morris, quite young, in his early 30s, I would have thought. And he'd had quite a colourful life prior to this. He was an adherent of the Earl of Strafford, who was Charles's first minister. He was executed before the Civil War. He then fought for the Royalists, but when Liverpool surrendered, I think he was taken prisoner. For some reason, we don't know why, but he signed up to be a parliamentarian.
Right.
Now, I think he regretted that, and they didn't like him. I think they suspected him, probably rightly so, and I think he was a little bit in for boozing and wenching and other cavalier pursuits.
Wenching,
yes. And I think the parliamentarians disapproved. So when they reformed their army, he didn't get a job, and eventually he drifted back into royalism.
Right.
But he's just the kind of person, if you've got some difficult job to do, like capturing this mighty castle, just the kind of person to do that.
Fantastic. And so what happened then?
Right, well, the Royalists were very keen to get Pontefract. It had a smallish garrison in it that Parliament had put in it. They couldn't put soldiers everywhere, so there was a little bit short of men. And Morris was a local man. He knew the castle, and he was the person that was given the job of trying to capture the castle for the king. And he had a couple of efforts at this. He knew some of the people inside the castle, and on one occasion he thought maybe they could work something out. That didn't work. But ultimately, he got into the castle by arranging a delivery of beds.
No way.
Yeah, the defenders, the parliamentarian defenders, thought we need more people in the castle. You know, they can't be living out in the town, but if we're going to put them in the castle, we need to give them somewhere to sleep. So they ordered these beds, and it was Morris and his mates that decided they would deliver them. But of course, it wasn't just beds that they brought in weapons, etc.
Right.
And of course, here are the beds.
Were they hidden inside?
Well, they hidden.
Okay.
As soon as the parliamentarians opened the gates, so they could bring in the beds, they kind of rushed into action. They overpowered the guards, and the castle was held for the king for the next 9 months.
Okay, fascinating. And so I understand that Cromwell's army surrounded the castle and sort of blocked off, ways to get in, ways to get out. Do you know much about that, about Cromwell's role in that?
Yes, originally it wasn't Cromwell, but Cromwell kind of came in when it was realised that this was quite a tough nut to crack and they needed their A-team there. Really.
Sure.
I think one of the problems was it was such a big castle that you couldn't really block it off. There were always ways out. You couldn't have people all the way around the castle. And the defenders of the castle, so the royalists under Maurice, they used to nip out on raids.
Right.
So they'll go out and nick a load of cows, or they'll go and plunder somewhere. I don't blame Maurice, because the moment he went into the castle, the parliamentarians plundered his house.
Right,
and they took thousands of pounds worth of stuff away from it. But one of the most significant things that they did was that they tried to capture a quite leading parliamentarian soldier called Rainsborough. Now, Rainsborough was rather an admirable character, in my opinion. He'd spoken at the Putney debates, which was this argument about what politics should be like after the fall of the monarchy. And he was a supporter of the Levellers.
Yes.
Who they weren't socialists, but they were a little bit more democratic than everybody else was at the time. So he was quite a popular figure amongst the army, and he was sent up to besiege the castle, and he was staying at Doncaster. And Maurice and his defenders got wind of this, and they thought, if we can capture Rainsborough, we can use him to exchange for one of our commanders, a chap called Marmaduke Langdale. What a great name, Marmaduke Langdale. So they duly set off, I suppose, at night, and they got to where where Rainsborough was, but he wouldn't go quietly. And there was a sort of fracas, and in the fracas, Rainsborough was killed, which isn't what they intended at all. They didn't intend to kill this man. No. It wasn't. The plan was to catch him, but of course that upped the stakes as well. And after that, I think that the defender's days were numbered, to be honest. Certainly the commanders in there, and they gradually increased the intensity of the siege. That would be the way to look at it.
Fantastic. And could you tell us a little bit about the death of Charles I? Obviously, very infamous or famous event in history. And what happened?
Once Charles had started the Second Civil War, he was seen to start the Second Civil War. There was a substantial minority of parliamentarians that thought he would have to go. Should be said that this is not all of Parliament. A third of Parliament had gone off at the start of the Civil War and joined the King anyway in Oxford.
Right.
So this was the remains of those. And of those, most people couldn't conceive of the idea of executing the King. But a substantial minority who really backed the army at the time, Cromwell's and Thomas Fairfax's army, they felt the King had to go, and to enable that to happen, they purged Parliament. So all the MPs turned up one morning, and they were armed men outside Parliament with a list. And if you were on the list, you went in. If you're not, you're not on the list, off you go. And some were even imprisoned. So as a result, you had this very small number of MPs. They called it the Rump Parliament, because it was all that was left, the fag end of this Parliament. And it was they that put into motion, ultimately, the trial in Westminster Hall of Charles I. Now, they had real problems with this because it was illegal. Right. There was no law that enabled them to do this. And this is where really Charles came into his own, because he ran rings around them at the trial by saying, what's the legality of this? There is none. And if you start making up laws after the event in order to execute me, what about everybody else? You can do it to them. And he had a point. But they pushed on with this, and at the end of January 1649, he was duly executed at Whitehall, outside the banqueting house. Big trouble for Parliament was that they were so keen to get it done, they hadn't thought what they were going to replace it with. Just get it done. Republic means republic. Get it done. Well, what are we going to do afterwards? Well, don't worry about that. We'll deal with that later. And they never could.
Okay. So we're looking at this coin today, which is why we're discussing Pontefract siege. And this is a coin from the siege of Pontefract, and this is made by melted down sort of plateware donated by the royalists, and formed into this emergency coinage, which I'm so glad you said that there were ways out of the castle, because I was thinking, how did they spend these coins that they were creating? But you can really tell that it's an emergency piece because it's created in this very unusual shape here, which is very easy to create when you don't have, you know, a full mint at your disposal. So you're chopping it and you just make a nice, easy sort of square parallelogram. It was also made by hand engraved dies, which again you can see here with slightly cruder style than you might see on another coin, hammered coin of this time. And as we can see here, we have CR for Charles I, topped with a crown, and then we have a Latin legend around the side. Could you tell us a little bit about the legend?
Yes, Dum Spiro Spiro, so while I breathe, I hope. So in other words, while there's life, there's hope. Because they were in, the defenders, Maurice and his men, were in a very tricky situation because by the summer of 1648, the parliamentarians had defeated the Scots, so there was not likely to be any kind of relief for them. So really they were hanging on to the bitter end. So I suppose it was a sort of, well, maybe something will crop up, kind of attitude, I think would be the way to look at it. Yeah. So that's what that was about, and so it's a very fitting motto, really, for the defenders of that castle.
Absolutely. And then we have on the other side, we have obs, which is sort of Latin for besieged, a shortening of there, and then Pontefract Castle, the denomination of a shilling, and the date. So a very literal coin that we have here. Not always the case, but telling us where it is, what's happening, and a lovely vista of that fantastic castle that you describe. So that's the coin, and so what sort of things were they spending it on?
Well, I don't think they had a lot of things to spend it on, really. I think that the main thing was, if you've got a load of soldiers in your castle, you've got to pay them.
Yeah.
Because if you don't pay them, they're going to start sneaking out, aren't they? And so you've got to maintain some semblance of normality. And I think it was as much that, you know, like, no doubt they gambled with them, I would have thought. Yeah. And they may well have gone out and exchanged them for things on their sort of periodic rate, although I think they were more interested in looting things than buying things. But it was really, if you've got soldiers, you have to give them something.
Let's keep them happy, don't you? Yeah.
So I think that was the main thing. But also, you know, what you put on it can be quite important, can't it? Because you're making a point.
Absolutely.
You stand for continuity, you stand for the king.
Yes.
You know, when there's a new king, you announce that by what you put on your siege coins as well.
Okay, fantastic. And is this, obviously this is emergency coinage, is this the first time this sort of coinage was created?
It's not. It happened during the Italian Wars, in fact, in the 16th century at Pavia. And during the Dutch Revolt, which happened before the Civil War, a number of places there, I think Leiden was one that produced them. And there were a number of places in England that did produce these coins. It wasn't only at Pontefract, so there were some that were produced at Carlisle, for example, some, not many, but some at Scarborough, and very famously a large number at Newark. Things were more complicated at Newark because it wasn't just a castle, it was a whole town.
Yes.
And consequently, you know, you did have trade going on, so people needed these coins. But they certainly attracted interest at the time. And one parliamentarian newspaper at the time actually did a report about it.
Oh, fantastic. Do you have that report today?
I do indeed. This was published in a news sheet called The Kingdom's Faithful and Impartial Scout. Interesting, they called it the Kingdom, because the king had been executed and the monarch had been abolished, but there we are. And it says this: the intelligence from Pontefract, which is what they call Pontefract at the time, is this: the besieged have lately made 2 sallies forth, so there's an example of them going out of the castle, but were repulsed without any great loss to us. In the last, they killed but 1 man of ours, and we took 2 of theirs prisoners, one of which had a small parcel of silver in his pocket, somewhat square. On the one side there was stamped a castle with P.O. for Pontefract, and on the other side was the crown with CR. These pieces were made from plate, which they get from the country and pass amongst themselves for coin.
Fantastic.
So, perfect description of what we have here. You can just imagine, can't you? You know, But what are these things? Passing it round in the Council of War. So what have they made here?
And quite an unusual shape as well.
Yeah. So they've noticed it all, haven't they? In that.
They have. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for finding such a historical piece of text. So I discussed what this was made of. You know, melted down silver. there's discussions about whether this was donated by royalists, that was looted. What do you think? Where do you think it came from?
Well, it's a mixture of the two. Loyal royalists did donate plates, so we know, for example, that the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, many of those donated silver and gold to the royalist cause, so it could be melted down. But more often than not, it was also just taken. You go into somebody's house and you say, I am requisitioning this goblet for the war effort.
Okay.
And it wasn't only the royalists that did it, the parliamentarians did it as well, and they were particularly prone to taking plate connected with churches.
Okay.
Because they were Puritan and anti-bishop, and so in a way it suited them that they could justify it. So, for example, in 1642, a chap called Arthur Hazelrig got into Chichester Cathedral, and they'd hidden the plate behind certain panelling, but he went around knocking, and then he heard the rattling, and he got off the panelling, and then there was all of this plate. So, there's a lot of this stuff going around, and, it would have been melted down in the pot mints as well. But in a place like this, they had to sort of do what they could.
Exactly.
So who knows what was in the castle originally?
Yeah.
It's quite possible that the guys that joined Morris, because it became a focus for royalism, sort of royalist patrons, maybe they brought stuff along with them. It's quite possible.
Absolutely.
But I wouldn't be surprised if quite a lot of it was removed from local houses and places as well.
I mean, as a numismatist, it's very interesting for me because coins should weigh the same. If they're a shilling, they should weigh a certain amount, but these just don't have that consistency at all because it could be made of a goblet, could be made of a plate, it could be made of, a tiara almost. So you get this inconsistency in weight, which I just think really adds to the kind of historical element of it, because each piece is so individual, and it's been donated, looted, as you say, from an individual's collection, which is just fantastic. So that's wonderful. Just a final question for me, if that's okay. So our coin here has a hole in it, what we call pierced. Why would that be? Why would there be a hole in it?
Because people like to wear them as souvenirs. Now, whether that was parliamentarians that wore them as a symbol of the fact that they had seen, or whether in fact it was royalists wearing it. Although I suspect that after 1649, it probably would have been a bad idea to overtly wear a royalist symbol. Yeah. But that's the thing. It was pierced in that way, and people wore it as a souvenir. So you just wonder, don't you, whose neck that was round? Was it one of the parliamentarian soldiers? Yeah. Probably, but who knows? Yeah.
Who knows? That's the mystery, isn't it? And so we're fortunate enough to have this piece of history here in front of us to inform all these stories you've been telling us. And so what happened to the castle? What happened to those figures we were discussing?
Well, it was really at the end of the winter, beginning of the spring, 1649. It was quite clear, I think, to the royalists, even the most optimistic ones, that there was no way out of this situation, and ultimately they would run out of supplies. Yeah. So they negotiated a surrender. But perhaps inevitably, not everybody was going to be given mercy. This wasn't unusual at that time. And in the end, they said that all of the defenders could go, apart from 6 people. Okay. And one of those was Morris. And they essentially said that they would have to take their chances with the law. But they also sort of accepted that Morris might try and get away. Right. Which he did. And he got as far as Lancaster, where he was in disguise. But he got recognised and he was popped into Lancaster prison for a while. And then he was tried at York. Okay. And he used the same defence as Charles had done. He said, how can you try me for treason when I'm fighting for the king? Yes. And they well, never mind about that, and he was ultimately found guilty and he was beheaded. Okay. So that was the end of poor John Morris. It was also, to a certain extent, the end of the castle, because the locals who lived around the castle, they got a bit fed up with this, because this was the 3rd siege that had gone on. Was it? And if you go to Pontefract today, the church which is next to the castle, it looks like it's been bombed. Right. And your first instinct is, it must be something to do with the Second World War, but it's not. It was the damage from the Civil War. So these people that lived there are not that castle again, and if we don't put a garrison in it, the royalists will have it. Yeah. If we do put a garrison in it, we're going to have to pay for them. And Cromwell sort of encouraged them and said, well, why don't you ask Parliament to demolish it? Okay. Because they didn't demolish castles willy-nilly. The idea that Cromwell went round putting them down is not the case. It was always done through an Act of Parliament. Okay. So an Act of Parliament, on behalf of the inhabitants of Pontefract, the castle was demolished. It cost quite a lot of money to pull it down, but of course there was so much good building material there and lead on the roofs.
Yeah.
I reckon they probably made a profit out
Right,
of it.
okay.
So if you go to Pontefract now, it's a remarkable site. There's a few bits that survive, including some rather eerie dungeons.
Wonderful.
So often dungeons in castles are storerooms, but these were definitely dungeons. And for example, Richard III had some of his opponents locked up in them before they were executed, and some of the parliamentarian prisoners were kept in them. And there are names scratched down there, so you've still got the dungeons. And you've got the outline of the castle, but not much more than that today. So there's not a great deal there that would suggest what a powerful place it was, but it was indeed. Interestingly, by the 19th century, you had all this mixed space in the castle, and they used it for growing licorice. And you may have heard of Pontefract cakes, which aren't cakes, but they're little round coin-like things. And interestingly, they have, just like the coin that we have here, they have a castle on them. So it's an interesting sort of culinary reference back to what we're talking about, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I love that, the idea that, this sort of piece of war, it's turned into a little cake. That's a wonderful place to end it. And thank you so much, Julian, for talking to us today.
Love to see the coin.
Thank you very much.